So I'm Jen Stanford, and I'm going to be facilitating the panel this morning. And so I'm going to give a very brief introduction to our panelists, and then I'm going to open the floor to each of them to introduce themselves in more detail and say a few words on their perspectives relating to David's talk. So in addition to David on the panel, we have Dr. Kateri Salk, who's a visiting assistant professor of water resources at Duke University, and also an alum of the Michigan State CERTL program. And next, we have Ms. Antoinette Torres, who is Director of Strategic Initiatives and Institutional Effectiveness at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. And finally, we have Dr. Orlando Taylor, who is VP for Strategic Initiatives and Research at Fielding Graduate University. So welcome to our panelists. And please. And so with that very brief introduction, could you please introduce yourselves and provide any additional details about your professional or personal identities that you would like to share, and say a few words on your perspectives relating to David's talk. And I'll start with you, Dr. Salk.
Thanks, Jen. I'm Kateri Salk. I'll be sort of providing the early career perspective as a former CERTL alumna. I'm currently at the Duke University Nicholas School of the Environment, where my teaching and research activities focus on water resources, water quality, and data analytics. I've been creating some curriculum there around this sort of new thrust in data science. So that's a little bit about me. David, I wanted to thank you for a masterclass on how to give a compelling presentation without relying on the crutch of having slides. So thank you for that, first of all. A few things that sort of resonated with me. I think we can be as inclusive as we like in our own classrooms and provide inclusive approaches for teaching and learning, but we need to be mindful of the fact that our students are coming in bearing this burden of non-inclusive legacies that might be coming from generations past, not even in things that they've directly experienced. So sort of being mindful of that and paying attention to that. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is that we often have these students who are underprepared in certain aspects of our courses, but making sure to make them feel like they belong and that they have valuable insights to share, because they often really do. So making them feel like they do, and that emphasizing when they have those perspectives to share. I think that was a nice point to emphasize. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Toni Torres. I am Native American and Mexican American, so I come with a unique perspective in the experience of science and science learning. I spent most of my career, which is very, very long, I'm this close to retirement, looking at the issues of equity and access in STEM. So this is an important conference and has been really gratifying to be here, so thank you to CERTL for the invitation. The presentation earlier really resonates with some of the comments that I will bring in my discussion, which is, what is different about the experience of diverse science learners in the classroom that contributes to chronic underperformance and perspectives about failure, when what these students really bring are strengths. And so that really resonated with me. The other, I'm at a new institution. I've been at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Arts for 2.5 years. It's a highly, highly selective institution, and there is an ethos of rigor, and more is better. And so hearing that comment about what is essential to equip the learner with the capacity to deal with the new, the novel, and the unknown is a really big question for us, and it is something that we're grappling with as we look at our system of prerequisites and our course patterns.
Good morning. I'm Orlando Taylor. I'm also a longtime participant in programs with CERTL and the whole matter of including all of our students and people in our country and around the world in STEM education. I'm at Fielding Graduate University in Santa Barbara, California, and a longtime member of the faculty and administration of Howard University in Washington, a member of the CERTL network, and formerly served on the advisory committee, so I have a long history with CERTL. David, I really, really enjoyed your talk, and I have so much I could say, but I have to be brief, I know that. But I'm very pleased that David started with World War II in the GI Bill and talked about missed opportunities, because I did a fast forward on that and thought about the potential for another missed opportunity in 2020, and that is, as we look at the changing demographics in higher education today, we know that increasingly the largest number of students are coming from populations that are traditionally underrepresented. Some research tells us that in about a decade or so, the majority of students in American colleges and universities will be students of color. And the implications for the country with regard to producing a workforce and entrepreneurs and innovators in science really must pay serious attention to that, because if we don't produce a workforce that's somewhat comparable to who's in the pipeline in higher education, in the United States will not remain a competitive force in science. So I thought that was a very important context about missing opportunities. And then from there, I'm so glad you talked about the fact that this conversation is not just about pedagogy. And you talked a bit about the perspectives you had in that early biology class. You looked at who are you teaching. And that means that one of the takeaways I hope that we've gotten from this conversation this morning is that in the preparation of future faculty does not start with preparing future faculty, it starts with the intrinsic aspects of ourselves. What are our implicit biases? What are our perceptions? What are our expectations? What are our belief systems? And so on. Because that's where we have to start, looking internally at ourselves as students, as faculty members, as leaders, as administrators, and so on. And that's where we have to start. We have to ask those tough questions. It is not just focusing on what type of pedagogy that we're using in our science classrooms. So that's what I thank you for that in those observations. And then finally, the psychosocial dimensions of learning, the environment for learning, the environments that we create for learning, the attitudes and perceptions that we give students about becoming a member of the science community. So very important. So if we focus on those aspects and focus on who is delivering the education, facilitating the education for our students, another very important dimension. So we'll come back to more of that a little bit later on.
Thank you so much. So as we've done with the other panels to this point, we're going to have a few questions that were prepared by the planning committee, and then we'll open it up to the audience for some questions. So I'm going to start with a question for David. So you spoke about content in STEM, and changing the content of introductory STEM courses is a multi-level problem that may require change at the level of textbook companies, individual faculty implementation, curriculum committees, and multiple department buy-in in some cases. So aside from changing their approach to teaching, what can individual faculty do to make change to content in introductory STEM courses if there's not universal support for this type of change? Or worse, if departments think that these encyclopedias that you referred to are the syllabus, which you discuss as a challenge?
Yeah, I don't know if this is working. I don't think I have an answer for that. I think that if you are in a department that doesn't get it, and that you don't have the influence to try to persuade your colleagues to change the way they think about your syllabus, then that's going to be really tough. We did a survey as part of this little experiment I was talking about, very informal, rather unscientific survey. We asked 500 persons across the country who teach introductory biology. We asked them, where does your syllabus come from? What are the factors that decide what's in your syllabus? And actually, I was surprised, but the top two reasons by far were that it was the department that decided what should be in the introductory syllabus, and second, it was the upper level courses that were saying that this is what needs to be covered in the introductory courses. So if the department is not willing to engage in a conversation about these things, just the illogic, really, of saying that you have to cover this in your intro course in order for the junior level course to understand something, because that's just illogical, because that really doesn't happen. The students don't remember that stuff anyway, and why do we assume that they're going to make it to the junior level course if they leave after the freshman level course? And so, so it's a great question. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer, except just to encourage individuals, if they are in a situation like that, to reach out. We're certainly interested in working with you. I think that one of the things that we might be exploring at Hughes is to develop some way to bring instructors together who are teaching introductory courses, to spend a couple of days in a workshop in which they will develop their own syllabi using the kind of principles that we believe are important, so that they would then leave after a couple of days with at least a framework or at least a skeleton of a syllabus.
Thank you. So this question is for Kateri. You trained at a CERTL institution and engaged in CERTL programs, and now you're a visiting assistant professor. Congratulations. So what part of your training do you think best prepared you to be an inclusive faculty member?
So I'd first like to make a plug for all the awesome training that CERTL provides. So I was fortunate enough to participate in Michigan State University's Future Academic Scholars in Teaching program, a year-long professional development program. But I also participated in CERTL-wide events. So I did a CERTL exchange. I participated in a lot of the webinars, and then the massive open online course as well. So there's a big diversity of things available for folks at all different engagement levels. So I think that's really been a valuable thing to have as a graduate student for these opportunities. I think sort of two major impacts came out of this type of training. The first is related to pedagogy. So we get this training in these evidence-supported techniques for inclusive teaching and mentoring. This includes anywhere from eliminating bias, through cooperative learning, through universal design, and so on. So all of these different topics are covered in different aspects in these different types of training events. The fact that I got to return to it early and often as a graduate student and now as a faculty member, so we know that when we teach students things and learning happens when we interleave this learning throughout the process, when we iterate upon it. So the fact that I was able to engage with inclusive strategies and inclusive practices early and was able to iterate on that process, it then became a lot more natural to put that into practice as a new faculty member. Not having to approach that for the first time in my classroom or to try to learn that scholarship for the first time. So I think that was a huge thing, was just learning the pedagogy and iterating upon it. The second was sort of related to one of the core ideas of CERTL, of having these learning communities. So at Michigan State, we had this diverse group of fellows in our program from all around campus. So just the fact that we had people that were not coming from our discipline, that were not coming from the same place that we were, we had to use these inclusive practices to really engage with one another over the shared interests. That's kind of translated over into becoming a faculty member and finding these communities of practice on my new campus. So finding the faculty in my department who are interested in effective teaching and learning, finding the Learning Innovation Center at Duke and engaging with them, with their faculty active learning fellows, engaging in my diversity and inclusion committee in my own department. So finding these communities of practice has really helped in this environment where I have specific roles to also kind of engage with the inclusive practices. So I think modeling that as a graduate student as part of my training has helped me to engage with those new communities of practice as a new faculty member.
Thank you very much. So this question is for Tony. So you've spent your career thinking about issues of diversity and inclusion and how to promote equity and inclusion in higher education. And you think a lot about how to use data in your work. How do we best prepare faculty to both use and be receptive to data as a driver for promoting inclusivity?
One of the biggest challenges we've had, and I've had in my experience in working with data, I didn't start working with data, I started working with pedagogy. But data really, first, I heard yesterday, and it made me think about this, assume the power you don't have, when in fact, for me, it's speak truth to power, that there are prevailing attitudes out there about the preparation and the performance of students, and in particular underserved populations, including women and underrepresented minorities in STEM. So data really gives us the opportunity to unpack prevailing assumptions. So for instance, earlier we heard about the under-preparation of students in calculus and underperformance. That work was done early in my career when I was at Berkeley with Patricia Gandara. And what we found is people presumed that students of color, African American, Hispanic, and Native American students who were underperforming in calculus came in less prepared, when in fact the reality was their profiles were commensurate with that of their non-minority peers. So what was playing out? That entailed the work and the collaboration of faculty, including the social scientists and ethnographers, and the staff to begin understanding the lived experience of underserved students, many of whom were commuters, many of whom lived in their neighborhoods, and many of whom had no peers in the classroom. That led to the groundbreaking work by Ori Treisman, with whom I worked. What we began to look at is the integration of academic and social spheres and how to make those students part of an academic heuristic community, a learning community. And that was really the start of our learning communities. That integration led, I will say, to the performance of underserved populations. By the end of our first year, they were outperforming every other student in calculus. I continue, and it's calculus. There is something about calculus, e to the I theta, I don't know. But one of the things that I encounter on a daily basis is the students who are failing out. We heard about attrition, that the attrition rates for underrepresented minorities and women in STEM, although that's decreasing slightly, are higher than that for their non-minority peers. And the attribution, again, is preparation. They didn't have enough AP. They didn't have enough honors. Their SAT is lower than majority students. Well, we've tested those hypotheses. I've been at a few institutions. And what we found again is that they were, and I'm at selective institutions, they were equally prepared. So the reality had nothing to do with preparation. But what we found through careful longitudinal analysis is that the students, once they earned that first D in calculus, it led to a pattern that increasingly their performance decreased. And within 3 terms in the last institution, and I did some consulting, they left. What it began to open up are questions about what's the difference? How were they integrated into the classroom? How were they socialized to the classroom? But also, what was their mindset? These are students who were superstars in their schools. And now they're coming in and they're encountering dissonance, cognitive dissonance. They're encountering a new kind of rigor. And how have we equipped them to understand that that's what they are experiencing? What is the conversation and what is the onboarding to begin addressing that? Other challenges we've seen are in the admission of diverse students. I just recently worked through an admission cycle at my new home institution, and what we were able to do in one cycle is increase the representation of women by 25% in STEM. So we're now 40% of the School of Engineering. What was the difference? We asked faculty to read the essays, and we heard that earlier, and really engage in conversations with the team about what was prohibiting their recommendation for admission. And what we found was the recommendations were not coming to not admit, were not coming from faculty. They were coming from the admission teams who perpetuated a mythology about the performance of women in calculus and chemistry at our school. And so we very quickly dispelled those myths with the prudent use of data. So institutional research provides a context for conversation, but really it's the institutional research with the community of faculty and staff that begin to drive effectiveness, and with the perspectives of faculty and the appropriate analysis and conversation, we can become much more empathetic. So let me leave you with some thoughts about those students coming in today and some of the new challenges that I think are emerging for us. Students are coming in with lots of AP. The College Board has just recommended a limit of 5 AP, and yet access to AP has been socioeconomically limited. So students at lower resource schools have less access. But the proliferation of AP courses may have watered down their very benefit, which is that deep and rigorous learning, the opportunity for social engagement around academics. Students are coming in studying to SAT. And so we are seeing that SAT, although not the most predictive indicator of performance, SAT scores are becoming less predictive, and we are seeing grade inflation in high school. So we are having students enter our campuses with strong sense of self, whether they're minority or majority, a very strong sense of self, a very strong sense of what they will be able to do without much sense of time, how much time it takes to do deep work and deep learning, without necessarily the experience, especially in low-income communities, of teamwork, collaboration, engagement, mediation, negotiation, the characteristics that are part and parcel of good problem-solving practice and heuristic problem-solving practice, and coming in with an expectation that learning is about being delivered knowledge and not acting with the knowledge. And so the challenges for the faculty now are, how do I begin to move students from where they are with a very naive sense, a very naive developmental sense of what learning is, and move them to new spheres of engagement? How are we preparing them to engage productively and successfully in their courses?
Thank you, Tony.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. You can clap for it. I think that leads nicely to the question we have for Orlando. You've been a national leader on issues relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. You also have a relationship with the CERTL network and other groups that are involved in the preparation of future faculty. How do you think that we can best prepare future faculty to ensure that they create inclusive educational environments?
Well, just a few remarks on that question. We've, of course, been involved with preparing future faculty as a formal concept since really about 1990, when we launched, we meaning the community, launched various preparing future faculty programs around the country, and we've utilized many methods and procedures to accomplish those goals. And we're still asking that question, so that means that we've got work to do. One thought that came to mind when you asked the question was perhaps it could start as early as the dissertation stage. One of our former colleagues in the Preparing Future Faculty program many years ago at Michigan, I think he's still on the faculty, Brian Capola, who's at Michigan, he used to argue for a chapter 6 for a dissertation, where the dissertation student would have to do a chapter on teaching to an audience different from him or herself about that which has been studied in the dissertation, to give that person an experience and exposure to articulating that which he or she might have learned through the dissertation process to an audience of people who are quite different from themselves. That was one thought he had, and was really an interesting thought. I think another way of preparing future faculty would be to give students an opportunity particularly from research universities, which are largely predominantly white institutions, to have an experience at a minority-serving institution, particularly HBCUs, for example. Using that one group of institutions, it's not well known, though I think many of us in the room will know this, that the top producers of African Americans who later get PhDs are not at research universities, are not in the CERTL network institutions. They're coming from HBCUs, and some would say, well, of course they do. They have more African American students. Well, the data don't support that. The classic example is one I like to use often. I know there was a student here from Georgia State the other day. Georgia State has more African American students than Clark Atlanta, Morehouse, and Spelman College combined. They have over 10,000 African American students. Those three institutions rank higher than Georgia State individually in terms of producing African American students who obtain the PhD. So we have a lot to learn from providing experiences from students at research universities to go to those institutions that are very successful in producing students who later acquire the doctorate. Another thought that I have here in thinking about this is that this is for leaders in the room. We really, as leaders and as faculty members, have to really rethink our models for hiring, promotion, and tenure to make sure that we really build an incentive system and a reward system that really celebrates the kinds of things we're talking about here today. We really kind of wink when we say service. We really kind of wink when we say teaching often. We really research we care about and grantsmanship, and those are important. I'm not talking about diminishing those factors, but if we really believe in preparing a faculty that's committed to diversity and inclusion, it's got to be reflected in the infrastructure, the policies, the procedures, and the reward systems of institutions. And until we do that, we'll just have rhetoric. We won't really do a lot. And the final thing is we do have to deal with the question about diversity of the faculty and leadership. We have to have an environment where students can see themselves, know that people like them have been successful and are succeeding, and that cannot be on the back burner. We have to do that. And then finally, I think we do need to think about our language in talking about these topics. And I was thinking about this, we were talking about minority students. If you're at an HBCU, your minority students are white students. And if you're 10 years from now, I'm thinking of the students today, minority students will be white students. Majority students will be students of color. So the whole construct about who is the majority is a changing notion. And so that attitude really has to permeate our thinking and our work.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience.
Hi, I'd just like to thank the panel. I'm Katrina May. I'm a PhD student at Georgia State University, which Dr. Taylor just mentioned. And he kind of hinted at the question that I have, which is we talk a lot about underrepresentation. And as a woman in math, I understand the importance of allocating resources and time to getting equitable representation. But there's this other concept of marginalization, which is, yes, we can get these numbers and we can get these people in there at equitable numbers, but we still face issues when we do get into these programs. And so how do we balance this numbers-driven approach to getting equal representation with also making sure that when we get these students there, they have equal opportunities and good experiences in these programs? For instance, LGBTQ students are not necessarily underrepresented, but we are marginalized. International students are not necessarily underrepresented, but they are often marginalized in their program. And so how do we balance these two concepts?
Something, it's an interesting, I didn't go down the path of the rest of what I prepared. So certainly there are these opportunities for faculty to intervene, and so that's a piece of it. So do we create a sense of belonging? Do students feel that they are integrated? Academic validation, the extent to which the actions of the faculty in the classroom impart to the student that they believe in their success, and that we are engaging them in using their strengths as we move forward. The interpersonal validation, where there are mentors or others who are invested in the individual, and then the institutional commitment to diversity. So those are some of the pieces. But there's another really profound piece, which is that if you are underrepresented in a classroom, how do your peers engage with you? And what we just did a climate survey, and what we found is that the peer microaggressions and aggressions and stereotypes were playing out profoundly in the classroom. I don't know the answer yet, but we have asked the question. We have surfaced findings that say this is real. It is a real and lived experience. And as a community, from the leadership to our faculty and staff and deans, how do we begin to think about developing the class, the cohort, as a cohort that's engaged in inclusive behavior and understanding. That's real work. We are engaging with our faculty of the humanities and social sciences around that to begin taking a leadership and stewarding role.
Just another question about who's admissible, if you could use that term. It's interesting to note that if you take an institution like Xavier University in Louisiana, many of you may know this institution, they brag about the fact, and it's a true fact, at least it was in recent years, that they're the largest producer of African Americans who later go to medical school. So at first glance you say, oh, they must be admitting lots of students who have high ACT scores, right? It turns out that their mean ACT scores there in Louisiana really are quite lower than the institutions that have the medical schools to which their students go. They come in with very, very modest, really, admission scores, really. But they have the largest per capita percentage of African Americans go to medical school, which means that the whole question about how we determine who's admissible, who has a potential for learning, who has a potential for success, really needs to be very carefully re-examined by all of us in higher education today. We've already seen many institutions now dropping the GRE or the SAT and looking at other indicators of likely success in higher education. That's our challenge as leaders, as faculty members, and for emerging leaders in higher education.
I need to add to that. So I did a project, it was a national demonstration project to mitigate over-reliance on SAT and the admission of underserved populations, low-income, first-generation, underrepresented minorities and women into STEM disciplines. It was very successful. One of the challenges has been, as we talk about holistic review, and as we talk about what is learning, what is it that we are trying to develop in the learner, is defining what those other characteristics are. Having a deep conversation about what those characteristics are and what it is, as you said earlier, we want them to learn. We have to articulate that. Right now what is become is kind of the challenge of the test, but we really need to have robust conversations about what it is we want students to learn. I will also say that one of the challenges is this idea of marginalization, especially at highly selective institutions. The populations are equally competitive, and that isn't well established. One of my challenges is I am competing for underrepresented and underserved populations with schools that are now providing full tuition rides. I haven't been able to yield. And so it's raised the question of, really, what are we looking at to predict the success of students without using predictive analytics, which are based on historic data, but not on future thinking data?
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Kate Kirby. I am a graduate student at Vanderbilt University. I'd like to thank the panel. A lot of your comments have sort of focused on this thread of mindset, learning, and growth. And while we are trying to blow up the introductory courses, is there a place for explicit growth mindset development in those courses, and how can we make the space for that?
I think that's you, David.
One of our challenges has been that student in calculus who gets the first D, and we try to understand how does the student attribute that failure? And what they often talk about is imposter syndrome. I must not be as smart as I thought I was because I didn't do well. But if you start unpacking those conversations, what you hear is they attribute their ability to do well to innate ability as opposed to work effort. And how do we begin to help a student understand what work effort looks like? In the early days with Ori Treisman, some of that was really about constructing problems that drove that understanding, right? The construction of the problem themselves. But we have to have those conversations. There's a wonderful model at Stanford and Harvard, the Resilience Projects, where faculty talk about their own struggle, and that the ability to fail and recover and understand how you are approaching your learning is an equally and long-lasting developmental exercise.
I also think about the fact that we have students coming into their first year of college, often coming off of the SAT, coming off of AP, where they need to get the correct answer. And so emphasizing to them that I'm not interested in hearing what the correct answer is. I'm interested in hearing what your thought process is to getting to your answer. And kind of cultivating that growth mindset within the culture of your classroom.
I like David when he said, focusing on what do you think versus what do you know?
Right.
Which is a
Absolutely.
very important part of that.
I put that in quotes
Yeah.
too.
There's a question. in the
Might
front.
also be, what do you feel?
Yes.
Which may be another part of learning.
We've been talking about, I'm Stacey Lawrence, staff member at the Sheridan Center for Teaching and Learning at Brown. So I work with a lot of STEM faculty, grad students, and postdocs. So we've been talking a lot about medical students, kind of beating around it. And so I guess I'd like to hear your perspectives on encouraging current faculty and future faculty on how to approach this reform in our courses when we have pre-medical students in the classroom that might cause a little of anxiety or tension between the reform we're trying to make. I've heard murmurings around cure courses or research-based courses not counting for pre-medical credits, right? So if we have students who are motivated to be pre-med students, how are we trying to shift the culture to say, okay, these research-based courses are important, you should take them, but when the higher, the MCATs or the review board says that this is not a reflection of what medical doctors need to be doing.
I think it's important to talk to the medical schools about what they're looking for. I'm surprised to hear that people seem to think that not doing a discovery-based learning experience, like a research experience or a course-based research experience, is detrimental to your ability to get into medical school. I think that if you talk to the people who are at the medical schools, your students might hear something very differently. One of the reasons I was surprised in the survey that I mentioned earlier, where the two drivers for what's in the syllabus had to do with what the department wanted and what the upper level courses wanted, I was actually surprised because I thought the pre-professional thing would be much higher. Actually, it was a sixth of a list of 6. It was towards the bottom. And if you look at the MCAT test, the MCAT actually no longer asks just what do you know.
Right.
It doesn't ask for memorization. It's a higher level. It's a higher Bloom's taxonomy.
Right.
So you're asked to synthesize. So you have to be able to recognize the terms and know what they're talking about. But that's not what they're asking on the MCAT. They're not asking you to just plug and chug. They're asking you, so given this information, what does this mean, or something like that. The other thing that I think we have to remember is that, to prepare for the MCAT preparations, for the most part, are not done in the classroom, but rather they're done through Kaplan or whomever is your students are paying to prepare them. And so I think, again, it takes some will, and it takes some courage, commitment, and to change, that we just have to say, that's not what my course is for. that if I want you to go to medical school if that's what you want to do, but this is not how you're going to prepare for the MCAT. So, I know that sounds kind of harsh, but that's my version of a growth mindset, right? We have to get past that.
And I think there's a way to recognize that extrinsic motivation of your student needs to do well in the MCAT to get to their next goal, but situating your coursework within what those motivations might be, whether that's pre-med or something else, and finding ways to reform without completely leaving that behind.
Something that we've been really thinking about, and I don't know where this is going to lead, but even as I work with industry, if we work with medical schools, industry will say we value collaborative learning. We want students who can think critically and who can communicate. And yet there is nothing that places a value, the value certification kind of from the industry just isn't there, but we know it to be true. And so the question is, how do we create a value system that is very different than the value system we currently have? And I think that's the question you're invoking.
Yep. And that's the same kind of question with the promotion tenure process
Yes.
as well.
Yeah, yeah.
What kind of person do we really want to retain
That's right.
within on our faculties?
Yep. Hey, thanks. Gabriel Angrand again. Tony, you just mentioned this idea of helping students to facilitate a conversation about their approach to learning. When I hear that, that is academic support, academic success centers, academic coaches, learning strategists. But for some reason, we don't necessarily have a seat at the table when it comes to student learning. And I was wondering, have you worked with institutions that do that? Why is it that we don't get a seat at the table?
So interesting. So, I was hired as a tutor coming out of high school at UC Berkeley for the entering freshman class in chemistry. I was involved in the Learning Center from 1975 until about 1981, and then I became a director in engineering. I learned very quickly that it was important to have a seat at the table. And one of the interesting ways for me, I was short, I still am, I'm even shorter. I was much thinner, a woman and a minority woman. What gave me voice was to begin to develop the narrative using data. And that's why I said truth to power. That was the piece that I thought I held back a bit. But for me, it is what gave me voice to help people understand the narrative. Right now, what is higher education consumed by? Beyond learning and beyond instruction and beyond degree completion, which are huge, right? Those have everything to do with our success, our commitment to our students, our efficacy, and our rankings. But the real challenges now also include mental health. Why are students so stressed? What is it about their learning experience that is contributing to some of the mental health challenges we are seeing? What are the challenges within the classroom about identity that may be contributing to some of the mental health challenges that we are seeing? So these conversations really need to be invoked between faculty, a learning center that engages the faculty with the staff, to have really deep and rigorous conversation and pull in that IR office. I think that more and more institutions you will see, people are looking for solutions, and the community has them.
Question way back there.
I wanted to thank the panel for what I was really thought-provoking comments. I agree with everything you're saying. I wanted to bring up, Antoinette, the notion of grades. In my perspective, I'm married to a college professor. Even in graduate school, students seem to be totally driven by, what do I do in this course to get an A, rather than, oops, what can I learn to my professional development in life. And I see that as a surprisingly large barrier to deep learning if the course isn't built and structured around opportunities for deep learning. One of the things that I value, but you don't find it in many places, is learning portfolios. So if you're in the performing arts, for example, you have a portfolio. That's how you present your knowledge. But we don't seem to have that in many of the STEM disciplines. But that's what really matters.
I agree. I recently developed a proposal. It wasn't funded, but it was about developing portfolios and this idea of certifying, finding ways to codify and certify these other skills that are involved in critical reasoning. It is something that I'm passionate about because there are game-changing conversations afoot especially given the kinds of needs from medical school to graduate schools for transformative thinkers, for people who are thinking critically about new and novel questions and challenges and applications. So I fully agree with you. We have had conversations about no grades in the freshman year. Didn't go far, but we will continue, right? You open a door, and I think early on we heard persistence, being courageous, being persistent, finding an opportunity to invoke the conversation. It may take a different turn, but that's okay. We're trying to get to that opportunity to equip our students with the capacity to learn as lifelong learners. I have to agree with you. We are seeing students today who are saying, I'm coming here, but I want to get to this graduate school, so grades are all important. That becomes a value conversation.
Just another comment on this is that I think it is extremely important, again, that we look at our language. It's very common in the STEM disciplines. We talk about some of the things that you just described as so-called soft skills. Soft.
Yes.
And you know, we all know about the hard sciences. And that sets up a dichotomy that's discouraging, the kind of things that you're talking about. We really do not need to understand that these are really important aspects of human learning. The other piece that I cannot really run away from is that we have to start with ourselves. It's very easy to say we want to fix our students or fix the underrepresented. Let's fix ourselves. Let's look internally. What are our values? How do we learn? And then from there, ask, how do other people see the world? How do they learn? What kinds of issues are important to them? That's why I like so much when David in his presentation said, what do you think?
Yeah.
I need to know that. That gives me a framework for having a moment of teaching and learning and discovery for both teacher and student. We're both in an environment where we're both learning. And that changes a whole paradigm.
Yes. That's that humility someone spoke to earlier today. Yes.
So we have time for one more question in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for this very rich conversation. My question is to David and/or anyone else on the panel who has insight here. My name is Rebecca Thomas, and I'm the chair of biology at Montgomery College, which is a 2-year college right outside of Washington, D.C. I really appreciated David's comment about the significant proportion of STEM students that start out at a community college, and many of those students that start there are from underrepresented groups. So I would really appreciate the panel to speak to our future leaders in STEM higher education about maybe the unique challenges and/or opportunities there are to partner with 2-year college faculty to address those unique needs of transfer students as a way to increase equity and inclusion in STEM. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the issue of community colleges, because it's a very common view in many research universities, particularly among faculty, that we're preparing future faculty to get a job at an institution like the one where they're getting a doctorate, where most of the jobs aren't, I might add. And that's a myth that we really need to think. We all say at the same time, the first 2 years of college are very important foundations for further learning. And if you don't do certain things very well at that level, you're never going to make it to the junior, senior, and especially the graduate school level. Yet we prepare graduate students to think we're going to go to a research university. And that's really a model we really have to think about as well, that we need to really have a commitment to advancing human learning irrespective of where it is. Where it's at the research university, community colleges, high school, it does not matter. It's all one system. It's all about developing humankind. And it seems to me that the whole model that we have in our research universities very often is one that marginalizes students who really have aspirations for the community college world. Where, by the way, not only are roughly half of students of color enrolled, about half of students in American colleges and universities are of all races and ethnicities and both genders.
So the national data are that just under 50% of all STEM baccalaureates have had at least a touch of a community college experience, and 40-something% started at a community college. About 25% of our STEM PhDs started at a community college. And so there's no question that that's important. Some of you might be familiar with our initiative called Inclusive Excellence. We are now in our third competition, so IE3 is rolling right now. It's not too late if you want to get into the competition. If you're familiar with IE3, we set out 3 challenges because we've learned some things from the first 2 iterations of Inclusive Excellence, the first 2 competitions. The 3 challenges are: how do you assess inclusive teaching, and how do you convert that, or how do you apply that to promotion and tenure, something that's already come up. The second is the content of the introductory courses that I spent a little bit of time talking about earlier. And the third is building genuine partnerships between 2- and 4-year schools. Now, the Inclusive Excellence Initiative, the HHMI initiative, still focuses on the 4-year school because we're still interested in the baccalaureate degree. But we recognize that, as was said, so many students are starting at Montgomery College or other places like it. So when we talk about a genuine partnership, I think it has to be, I mean, this is not rocket science here, right? It has to be a true partnership in which both sides are contributing and respecting one another. It's not just a community college gives me something and I take.
Right.
So one of the very simple things that we've learned from the first iterations is that we have a couple of universities that are building partnerships with the feeder school, right? With the community colleges from which students are transferring to the 4-year school. And so it's very simple-minded, but it's amazingly sometimes challenging. We have a particular place where the 4-year school knew exactly what community college the students were coming from because it was a closed ecosystem, so that was easy, right? So you didn't have to worry about 12 different community colleges. It was really just one. But the sharing of data between the registrar's offices was legally challenging. And so when a student transferred from the community college, this is in the University of Utah and Salt Lake City, I'm going to get the college wrong, but Salt Lake Community College, I think. Anyway, so when a student transferred from the community college to the 4-year school, that student they didn't know, right? The community college folks didn't know who transferred when and whatever happened to her or him. And so just the sharing of the data between the 4-year and the 2-year school took a couple of years of negotiation. But that's an example to me of a capacity change by the university and by the community college so that they changed their capacity, they changed their rules.
Yes.
The registrar's office, it didn't really cost a lot of money. It was just a matter of will and people actually being able to do this so that now they can actually share the data so that they actually know who's transferring and what happens to them and what their preparation was before and then whatever happened to them after they got to their 4-year school. So that's a very trivial example. It sounds trivial, example of what I refer to as a more genuine partnership, but it's important. When we talk about research experiences for students, why can't there be more research experiences at the 2-year school so that the experience by the student, even before she comes to the 4-year school, is more similar than to whatever is offered to freshmen at the 4-year school. And we're beginning to see some of that. So these challenges that we put forward in the IE3 competition, we think are meaty and chewy and they're not easy, but that's why we put them forward as a challenge. So if you apply to IE3, you have to take on one of those challenges. You can't go around it. You got to take on one of them, and you got to tell us what you're going to do about it. So we're really interested in learning more about how the kind of partnerships that I'm talking about can be built. What does it take, right, for this to work? And of course, I'm quite familiar with Montgomery College, and I'm familiar with some of the stuff that you were doing earlier with Georgetown, and I would suggest that wasn't a true. That wasn't as truly a partnership as it could have been. I think it was more of a take versus a give and take.
With that, please join me in thanking the panel.